Let's try this again. Where does free energy come from? Now, I said that Mohs law justifies free energy, but it's a very broad, generalistic justification. It doesn't really get down to the nitty-gritty technicalities of where does free energy come from. And all the conservative people who say it doesn't exist need to be convinced. So, what we have is a condition in which Mohs law spells out that condition in which electricity gets split apart into its fragments, in which the voltage is the applied voltage and the reactive voltage are at odds with each other by 180 degrees. Now, the reactive voltage is the voltage which changes due to resistance. That's what we call current. But there's no such thing as current. So there's just two voltages because it's voltage squared divided by resistance gives us watts. So one voltage is the applied voltage and the other is the reactive voltage. And when the two are polarity opposite to each other, 180 degrees distinguishing different from each other, now you've got a condition in which electricity has been fragmented into capacitive reactance and inductive reactance. And in that state, a load cannot see it, and it cannot see a load. So it cannot dissipate, it cannot leave the circuit, it has to stay in there. And if perchance it should be put back together again, it'll leave in so fast, it'll fry the circuit. That's when the circuit blows up or gets fried, is when all that accumulated energy leaves all at once. It can't wait to leave. But but that's when it's put back together again. When it's still in a separated, fragmented condition in which the applied voltage and the reactive voltage are at opposition to each other, all it can do is accumulate. And accumulates at a certain rate, but it can also do the opposite of accumulation. It doesn't dissipate, but it can cross-cancel itself. Because what it does is, when it's fragmented, since no load sees it and it can't dissipate, so the image of the energy that has occurred due to the reflection of the voltage, you see, it self-reflects. It uses itself as its own mirror to reflect from, to create its own image, a copy, to clone it, to clone a new image of itself. This is at every half cycle of an alternating cycle in an oscillating circuit that has this condition. The opposition of reactive voltage to applied voltage means every half cycle it's cloning a new image of itself, and the prior images don't go away, and so it accumulates unless they cross-cancel, in which it does remove several and diminishes the amount of energy that's there. But it doesn't go anywhere. It simply disappears because you're dealing with information. You're not dealing with energy anymore. When capacitive reactance and inductive reactance are together as electrical energy, conservation of energy applies, and everything's nice and simple. But when they become separated, it's no longer energy, it's information. The electrical engineer calls it reactance, but it's simply information, and it keeps cloning itself. Now, that's the mechanics of how free energy comes about. Where does it come from? It comes from pre-existing energy that's already there in the universe, and it simply makes copies of itself because we told it to. Now, when energy has been fragmented, let's say we fragment energy and we fail to put it back together again and we lose it. You'd think, well, how can you lose it? Well, we can't, but the universe can. And it gets lost all the time. And we lose it when we meditate and we release stress. Where does the stress go? It goes out into the universe. And what happens to it? It accumulates. Because it's going to have to accumulate somewhere. And when it accumulates enough, pralaya happens, and then the universe goes to sleep and makes it go away. It somehow makes it go away. It probably cross-cancels it, but it takes a whole half cycle for that to happen. You know, it takes, 2.2 quadrillion years for the day of Brahma to terminate and for the night of Brahma to begin. And that's when everything in creation goes to sleep, goes into virtual reality, and the stress of all of this fragmented energy that's been accumulating all this time is removed. So, in a sense, you could say that reactive power is its own impediment to energy. It's no impediment to itself because it doesn't see any impedance. It doesn't see any resistance, nor can any resistance or impedance see it. Yet, when it gets put back together again, we have a rage, a temper, a temper tantrum. We break down with a disease because that's a tremendous amount of energy, and it may be that it has an energy without a goal anymore. It long since forgot what its purpose in life was. It's been reacting all this time. It lost its memory of what it was supposed to do when it used to be energy. But as a yogi, as a meditator, we call it stress. And all you can do is get rid of it. You can't do anything, make any sense out of it. It's impossible. It's too late for that. All you can do is get rid of it. And so there's a process. It's called yoga. And the universe has its process. It goes to sleep. And most people, that's all they have available to themselves is to go to sleep. So in a million years, they'll start becoming spiritual. But the yogi just wants to get there faster. So it takes deep rest and contact with the Absolute to get rid of deep-rooted stresses, very deep-rooted stresses. And that's probably what the universe does. It probably transcends to get rid of stress so that it can continue to be active, because it can't. By the end of the day, everything gets worn down and tired because it gets too much stress bogging everything down. So it's really no different than the way we look at life, but it's organic, and it makes sense to the common person who doesn't need a rocket science degree in physics to appreciate once it's explained in common sense terminology. But when you get fancy terms, it makes a muddle of the whole thing. I never did like this, but that's the way it is. So you have to become familiar with the terminology and be able to translate from the specialist's terminology into common sense terminology to make sense of it all. But you have to realize, too, then what it is that's taking place. So when reactance makes clones of itself, it does so because it cannot dissipate. It does not see a load. So that's why we say cloning, because the prior image that made the next image doesn't go away until it sees an impedance or a resistance, namely a load. Until it sees that, it can't go away. It's perpetuity. It stays in existence in perpetuity. And a perpetual motion holder works because there's no capacitive reactance to reunite with the inductive reactance that's zipping around inside that perpetual motion holder. So the inductive reactance is all lonely, all by itself, and it has to go on forever and ever like Sisyphus and never stop, because it can't become energy to see a load and leave the ferrite ring. It can't unless we tell it to. Now, when we engage a winding and close the circuit of that winding around that ferromagnetic toroid, the magnetism sees the capacitance of that wire, because the ferrite ring doesn't have any capacitance of its own, but the wire does. The insulated wire has insulation, and it's got capacitance. You can count on it. And the capacitance is going to be contrary to the way you look at the wire. In other words, we know capacitance is the square area of the plates, or the square area, I should say, of the dielectric, or of the plates. It's the dielectric, actually, versus the thickness of the dielectric. Well, in this case, the thickness of the dielectric of the insulation on the wire is the length of the insulation on the wire. And the square area of the dielectric is the depth of that insulation on the wire. So everything's been turned around cockamamie by 90 degrees. And so it's counterintuitive, but you have to think about it a bit. So a long strand of wire has very little capacitance, but it's there. And when the perpetual motion inside the perpetual motion holder sees that, it sees a load. It's been the load sees it, and it sees a load because the capacitive reactance of that insulated wire has now can join up with that perpetual motion when the coil of wire is closed into a loop. It can now release that stored inductive reactance, because it's just inductive reactance all by itself. That's why it's such a mystery as to why it keeps perpetually running around in a circle, because it can't reunite with its other half to form electricity, to thus see a load and leave the ferrite ring. So it has to go around perpetually, a loner. So you get an idea of how it works? It's really quite simple. We just have to think of energy. When it's fragmented, it's no longer energy. Thus, conservation of energy has nothing to do with it. It's information. And it cannot be conserved. It either cross-cancels and diminishes itself, or it amplifies itself by constructive interference. You know, it's either destructive interference or constructive interference that either diminishes the quantity of the amplitude of that reactive power or amplifies it, depending on whether it's destructive interference or constructive interference. But it's really very simple. It's just information. It's not energy anymore when it's been fragmented into its constituent ingredients. But when we put it back together again, it's energy, and then conservation of energy it has to be subservient to, and it has to leave as quickly as it can from its jail sentence to get out of the circuit. And it may fry the circuit in the course of doing so if too much has accumulated. So you see how easy it is to understand this? It's not that hard.